Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Horror Room. I'm Travis Bruce, and today we're doing another Women of Horror Spotlight. Today I have with us, she has a project, and it is called Horror and Opera. I have with us Alia. Alia, welcome to the Horror Room.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on. So tell us a little bit about Horror and Opera.
Yes, so Horror and Opera is a project that combines horror and opera. So I started working on it in 2020 during the pandemic. And the idea was first to rescore older pre-code horror films with new soundtracks that would combine elements of operatic singing. So my first project that I worked on was Haxan, a 1922 film. And my second project was Nosferatu.
Nice. So what gave you the idea? I mean, I know that during the pandemic, a lot of individuals, the creative juices were going, and they decided to come up with some great stuff was made during the pandemic. But what gave you the idea to, go back to some of these older IPs and put an opera theme to them?
Well, I mean, I guess it goes back really into my childhood because I was always a horror fan. While at the same time, I had like proper classical music upbringing as well. So it's kind of like I grew up with classical music and I was doing classical singing and piano since I was 6. So it's like a huge part of my identity. But horror was always something that I really gravitated towards. Like my first horror film I watched by omission through my parents because they were watching Nightmare on Elm Street. And they thought that I'm too young to remember anything. But this is where I actually had my first nightmare, like right after watching that movie, because like I was 3 and I remember it very well. And ever since, like when my parents realized that, it does make an effect on me, they got rid of all their horror tapes. But ever since, I've been looking for them, like, digging through their stuff, trying to find any kind of old VHS tapes. Yeah, that was pretty much, I became a fan of horror stuff back then. And I was always struggling to combine those two aspects of my personality because, on the one hand, there is this highbrow opera and music and classical music. And on the other hand, there is this pop culture, which is often, in the past especially, a lot of horror movies were also B movies, so they kind of considered like low culture, gore, etc. So I was always kind of wondering how can I combine them in something that is very campy and very eccentric, and that's how the project was born.
And it's a great idea because if you look at classical music and even horror, opera, it has like an eerie horror element to it.
Yes, for sure. And also because it's very technical, I guess it sounds very unnatural to how a human would sing because opera singers train a specific way so that they can cut through the orchestra and etc. etc. But a lot of people find operatic singing very difficult, especially if they watch like a full opera, which would be like 2-3 hours.
I can imagine. Now, when it comes to selecting, classical movies that you want to go ahead and add an opera element to it, what is behind your decision making? How do you select the films that you want to work on?
hmm Well, typically the film has to speak to me on some level. So in that sense, Haxan was my first choice, and I really enjoyed the early cinematography and how horror elements come through because it was a pre-horror time where horror was not really a genre. So it's really interesting to see how that, how essentially the cinematography is evolving to incorporate all those elements that would later be labeled as horror. And Haxan really went out there with how, for instance, the devil appears on the screen and appears to fly. So there's a lot of creative filming and creative directing involved in it. So it really spoke to me on that level. So that's why Haxan was the first one. With Nosferatu, I really like the backstory of the film itself and how it came to be. Because technically Nosferatu was, I guess, an illegal film based on intellectual property of Bram Stoker at that time, on Dracula. And the film survived by pure luck. All the copies of Nosferatu were ordered to be destroyed by the Stoker's estate, but the film only survived because it made it through to America, and America did not respect copyrights, European copyright. So, because I really found the whole backstory very, very fascinating, and how essentially the idea of Dracula resonates in Nosferatu, but also takes a completely different, basically also appears completely differently, because Count Orlok is very different from the character of Dracula in many ways. I just really found that fascinating.
Now, is it hard to try to translate at opera into, let's say, newer IP movies like you mentioned, The Nightmare on Elm Street or even a Halloween?
Is it hard? I think there are definite challenges, because all newer movies, they do have dialogue in them. And so in a way you have to constantly account for dialogue and for clarity, and hoping that, the plot itself comes through the film. While with silent films, essentially, because they use the title cards, the idea is that you read the subtitles, so you can really go overboard with the soundtrack and really develop it into like a coherent, flowing story in multiple movements, which is much harder to achieve with newer films.
There's just something that's eerie about silent horror films because you don't have that dialogue, so you're kind of using your own imagination, and you're kind of putting in your mind what is not there, and that's kind of chilling.
Yeah, for sure.
So right now, when it comes to horror, like horror has a resurgence right now, and a lot of the silent titles or even the older Universal titles, newer generations are being introduced to them. How is exciting is that for you?
It's very exciting for me that horror is getting again the love it needs. I mean, that being said, I know that, probably horror is actually that one genre where bingeability factor didn't get to it. With the Netflix, for instance, a lot of the modern content production revolves around making bingeable, series that are like that you can just put on the background and do the dishes and still get the plot and etc. With horror films, I think you have to be a much more involved viewer, also because sometimes plots are really weird and difficult to understand. With found footage, for instance, you have to pay a lot of attention what's happening on the screen, also because cinematography is shaky and sometimes you don't see the details. And I'm super excited that horror gets more love now, and I hope that trend continues. And maybe we will get to see a new generation of directors that experiment with new subgenres of horrors, with emerging subgenres.
I totally agree. Now you brought up found footage, and you talking about opera. One found footage movie, probably the OG of found footage, which is the Blair Witch Project, which I love. And I'm sitting there thinking, what would the Blair Witch Project look and sound if it had an opera theme to it?
Oh, that would be very interesting. Blair Witch. The whole aspect of the found footage revolves around this probably being a live footage. So, operatic soundtrack already adds a bit of a surreality to it. That being said, though, I am working currently on a project. It's not a film project, so it's more like audio storytelling, audio drama, where there will be elements of found footage and also elements of like really interesting and unusual sound design in them. But the idea is that it would be found footage in audio form, which is I'm really interested in developing that dimension.
Now, this is going to be your first, development original IP. Are you thinking about creating and becoming a filmmaker and actually creating your own IP, your own story?
That would be amazing. In terms of directing, that would be amazing to try. Unfortunately, directing is expensive. Making films is very expensive. So I don't know if that's in the books, but I would love to try that one day. That being said, I still like the idea of experimenting with maybe less involved mediums like audio drama or audiobooks or something along the lines, because I definitely enjoy horror storytelling, and I like, I read Stephen King, and I like how he writes his stories that are both relatable but also with the element of a lot of mysticism and horror in them. And I definitely enjoy horror storytelling and different ways to tell a story.
Now, as you know, the title of this interview is Women of Horror Spotlight. And I like to shine a spotlight on women of horror. I mean, because right now, there are so many women who are going, horror authors, filmmakers, just horror creators in general. What's your opinion why you think so many women are now jumping into the horror industry and saying, hey, we can do it too?
That's an interesting question. Maybe I guess part of the element of that is that, there are people like director of the Blumhouse who believes that women don't like horror, therefore they don't go into directing because he personally doesn't know any of them. So maybe part of it is the element of a challenge, and maybe part of it's that women do have a lot of horror stories to tell.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to be a very interesting dimension of horror as well that comes from more of the like lived experience horror. Like I really like films that, for instance, The Smile, that sort of add social commentary to horror as well. And I think more of those films with psychological dimension would be interesting to see.
I've noticed. So, like, I have women friends who are into horror, and it seems like, for the most part, I'm not saying that women don't like slashers and gore, but it seems like women mostly gravitate towards, like you were saying, psychological horrors, things that can really happen in real life.
I mean, probably it's mixed bag. Also, because I do know women who are into slasher, and they're also very particular characters. I think it's just maybe affinity for slashers. It's more on a preference basis, but when it comes to psychological horror, I think just a lot of women do encounter it in daily lives. So this is already something on the back of your mind, even if you're not as much into horror, or even if you don't have specific preferences towards slashers or other kind of films.
All right, so I am going to. So this is the part of the interview. I do this every once in a while with my guests. I'm gonna ask you 3 random horror questions. These are your personal opinion. Okay.
Okay.
Good. All right. What is one horror movie that most people love that you are like, it's okay, but I don't see why. I mean, but it's not the greatest thing ever.
Um. Okay. Will I get like booed for it somehow or
No,
punished?
no.
Um. I mean, I I do like some of the Michael Myers franchise movies, but I ultimately don't see why it's such a cult phenomenon. Like I watch Halloween sometimes, but ultimately I don't find it as grabbing as a lot of others do. So for me, it's always a bit of a puzzle, and also it's a bit of an unpopular opinion, but like I really like Halloween 3.
I like
Which,
Halloween 3 also.
yeah, yeah, but a
Season
lot
of
of
Witch is great.
yes, but a lot of people find it as kind of like an underdog of the series. But yeah, I guess unpopular opinion is yeah, I don't find the franchise very compelling.
So the original Halloween is my favorite horror movie of all time. I got something somewhere back on the wall. I do like Halloween 4 as well, but I kind of agreed. Like majority of that series is kind of redundant and it's not creative at all. There are some decent ones in the series, but I agree. Like that is one of the that's an answer that a lot of people give, and that's Halloween.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also the alternative timeline, it always confuses me, like why there needed to be a retcon of that, but here
Yeah,
we
there's
are.
so many jumps and so forth. It becomes confusing. You got the Colton Thorne timeline, you got the Rob Zombie, and then you have the Blumhouse. Yes, it can be confusing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. Second question. What is one horror movie series that you wish, and it can't be Halloween, that, that you wish they would take a break?
Take a break.
Take a break or never make another movie again.
Well, that's a little harsh. Hmm. I don't know. Actually, I can't think of any other franchises. Like, I do like Elm Street, and ultimately, I don't think they keep making them. I think they pretty much stopped at this point. Um, yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
Sorry.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre is my answer. I wish they would give a break, take a break on that.
Oh, I see. I haven't even watched that franchise, to be honest.
Yeah.
So.
But they keep rebooting and rebooting and rebooting them, and I'm like, yeah. The final question: what final girl do you feel like you relate to the most?
Relate to. Ooh, okay, that's gonna be an interesting one. Have you watched Hostel?
Yes,
Hostel
love
2?
that. Yes.
That one. That
Why is
final.
that?
Why? Because I think I really like the character, and I also kind of like how it was juxtaposed to the first film, where I guess um, all main characters are assumed to be victims. In this case, it's sort of the same story because also the characters are women, right? They all
Mhm.
assume to be victims, except that the final girl essentially has the leverage that no one is really discussing up until the end of the film, and she can turn the whole situation around. And that's why I don't know that I just found it very relatable and very interesting.
Hostel 2, underrated horror film. Actually, the Hostel series is a great series. I love the first Hostel movie. Um, and I say on my show all the time, I um, I relate to the Hostel series because at one point, I was traveling the world, quite a bit, and in my 20s, and like I was traveling everywhere, and I could have very easily fell into that situation, especially in my 20s. I feel like I could have definitely been captured, and yes, and been a victim. So I definitely relate to that series.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I also really like how the first film set it up as the framing is sort of that this is a situation that a lot of, I guess, people, especially like men traveling Europe, don't even think about that they would end up in that situation. But in the end, it's sort of works against them in this strange way that people wouldn't expect. I just try not to give up any spoilers.
Yeah.
To be very,
Especially us Americans, like when we go, like when I lived abroad, I mean, I could tell American a mile away because they're loud, they're they're abrasive, and like they're like, hey, look at me, you know what I mean? And that's I don't care where you go in the world, you can spot American a mile away because it's like, I need attention, look at me, I'm right here, I'm right here, I'm right here, and that's not a good thing to do in foreign countries.
no, it's not. Especially when there's certain like etiquettes of behaviors, things you don't say, or the way you don't behave out of politeness. But obviously, yeah, because a lot of American tourists they come with their own. Um, I wouldn't say baggage, but more like with their own mentality
Mhm.
and without understanding of how other cultures operate, which is yeah, that's why
Yes,
they're really obvious.
exactly. Now, Alia, where can everyone find you?
You mean on social media?
Hmm.
Yes, so I do have Facebook page and Instagram page, which the name is Alia Synesthesia, which is like my artist name. But also I have a website called horrorandopera.com, which is where I post news about the Horror and Opera project.
Awesome. Alia, it's been a blast to have you on. I'd like to also thank Marketing Macabre and Michael Joy for arranging this amazing interview.
Yeah, Michael is wonderful, and thank you so much for interviewing me.
Anytime, anytime. Listen, everybody, get over there and check out Horror and Opera and go into the website and stay up to date. All right, everyone. Well, thank you for coming to the Horror Room. I'm Travis Bruce, and that's Alia. We'll see you next time. Take care.